So Alex, we're going to talk about leasehold today. Before we look at what the government's saying about it, give me a quick layman's overview of what leasehold property is all about.
Hi Andy, thanks. Yes, so to define leasehold, I really need to define freehold first. You've got the two main types of property under English law. Freehold, which is a right to hold, to own land permanently, in a manner of speaking. And then below that, if you like, in terms of priority, is leasehold. Now leasehold you can define as by reference to a number of years. So whereas freehold is permanent, leasehold is a right to use the land, a right to have the land for a number of years. And so it's got a fixed term on it, if you like.
Now, from my knowledge of leasehold, if you're an owner, that can be quite expensive in terms of renewing leases. It runs into many thousands of pounds. Tell me about that.
It can be, exactly. So the current system has been around since the mid-90s, and under that system, the two types of leasehold property have slightly different schemes at play. So with residential leasehold property, you'll either have a leasehold house, in which always take full advice on your specific circumstances, but generally speaking, once you've owned a leasehold house for 2 years, you have a right to a 50-year lease extension. And you can do that once, and then after that you would have to go for buying your own freehold. You would not be able to extend your lease again. To do that, it's quite expensive as a process, as you've mentioned. Now with flats, it's slightly different. You can still extend a lease after you've owned it for 2 years. Again, an awful lot of exceptions involved, I'm afraid, but you get a 90-year extension, and also your ground rent is reduced to nil, or effectively nil. It's in legal jargon called a peppercorn. That's what we call nil.
And why is it so expensive to renew a lease?
So there are a number of factors involved. The key one in terms of expense, a lot of the time, is called marriage value. And marriage value is something that only comes into effect once your lease drops below 80 years in term. To describe it briefly, all that it means is once your lease drops below that 80-year period, the cost of extending your lease starts to go up almost exponentially. So it's always my advice to try and extend before your lease drops below that 80-year period.
Now the government has said something in the last few weeks about reform of leasehold. Tell me about that. Yes,
absolutely. So the government has introduced, well, it's suggesting that it will introduce new law. They've suggested that they're going to abolish marriage value entirely, which is quite a big step. So that has big implications for leaseholders and freeholders. They're also suggesting that they will do away with the current rules governing how much of a lease extension you can get. And so there will be no different rules for houses and flats. Instead, you'll get a 990 flat extension of your lease instead of the 90-year or the 50-year under the current system. So those are the two key areas that they're looking to reform. But beyond that, they're suggesting simplification of the entire process, because an awful lot of leaseholders and freeholders don't quite understand what rights they have at the moment. They're suggesting capping ground rents. Now there's been quite a big issue with ground rents at the moment, with leaseholders not able to afford their ground rents, or finding that they can't sell their properties or remortgage because of high ground rents. So the government's suggesting it will cap ground rents, and indeed reduce ground rents on new leasehold properties to zero. Beyond that, there's going to be some further consultation on what's called common hold. Now, common hold is a third way of holding property under English law. So you have freehold, leasehold, which we've already talked about, and common hold, which is the polar opposite of its name, as it suggests. It's not common at all. Nobody has really taken it up since the Blair government brought it in the early 2000s. And so they're looking at trying to incentivise that area so that more people take up common hold. The final area is further protection for the elderly. Now there's an awful lot of retirement properties across the nation where escalating ground rents that increase over time have been imposed on those who might not necessarily think through the longer term impact on taking on a lease. Someone who in their older age is thinking, I will only have this property for sort of 10, 15 years. It doesn't really matter if the ground rent goes up after 30 years. But if if you're taking that sort of outlook, you might not sort of think about how your estate after you pass away copes with the problems that sort of a lease could present.
And finally, would you welcome some of these changes, and do you think they're actually going to happen?
That's a very difficult question. In terms of welcoming them, absolutely. From a leaseholder's point of view, they add some clarity to the system, and it sounds like they would make the process a little bit cheaper. On the other hand, from a freeholder's point of view, it sounds like their interests might be negatively impacted by the proposed changes, and so it's very much a change which is generally being seen as is in the leaseholder's favour rather than the freeholder's favour in terms of how they'll actually affect the market. In terms of when the changes will come in, that's the more difficult part of the question. The government have suggested that they'll introduce it in 2 stages. The first stage is expected quite soon, but we don't have an exact date, and that's just the removal of ground rents in new leases. So any new leasehold property that's built and a new lease is granted when you buy it, your ground rent will be automatically 0. So that's expected quite soon. Everything else has been banded into a sort of stage 2, and there's no sort of time frame been given on that at all. No legislation has been brought before Parliament. There's nothing formal in writing at all. It's simply a government press release and a few tweets from the housing minister at this point saying we're going to be doing this. So it may be a number of years. It might not happen at all. There's no guarantee that any of this will actually come to fruition. And so that's all of what I've just said, unfortunately, has to be couched in the terms that we can't guarantee what the government will be doing next. And as I'm sure everybody watching this will know, at the moment the government has an awful lot on its plate.
Great. Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. Thanks, Alex.
No problem. Not a problem. Thank you, Andy.